Also started a fire in the underbrush so that not only were men being killed and wounded by gunfire, they were also being burned to death. One soldier wrote later that it was like, quote, hell had itself usurped the place of earth.
And the key thing here as it relates to Miner, though, is that a lot of the people participating in this battle were Irishmen who had come over to America to escape the famine and make a little money while they were at it. And these guys were able to get work as soldiers in the Union Army for $13 a month. But of course, during a war, and especially a situation like the Battle of the Wilderness, where trees are being chopped down by rifle fire, you're going to have a lot of people who just figure $13 a month is not worth this and desert. So around this time, the Union Army had a lot of people who were guilty of desertion or attempted desertion, but because they still needed soldiers, they had to figure out a way to dissuade others from deserting, punish those who did, without taking the standard punishment, which is execution. They needed the soldiers to keep on fighting.
Right.
So there were a few possible solutions. Some guys were suspended by their thumbs, others were gagged with bayonets, and others were branded with the letter D on their cheeks, or their cheek rather, their chest or their rear end with a hot iron, or they kind of were tattooed almost, cut with a razor, and then the wound would be packed with black powder, another form of branding ultimately.
So on one occasion, or at least sources only refer to one specific occasion, Miner was forced to brand an Irish deserter who'd tried to run away from the Battle of the Wilderness. So you can kind of imagine what this must have been like for Miner. He was the young, inexperienced doctor being asked to perform this horrible task. And, you know, an Irishman was probably brought to him crying, struggling, pleading, and Miner has to take the hot branding iron and put it to the deserter's cheek and watch him probably scream in pain.
Yeah, so most sources point to this as a defining moment for Miner, saying that it played a really big role in some of the strange, unusual things that started to happen in his life not too long after his war service. But after the war, Miner continued to serve in the Army for several years. He did pretty well for himself, actually. He rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a commissioned captain. But during that time, his behavior also started to become increasingly strange. When he was stationed on Governor's Island in New York, he started visiting brothels a lot, and after that he was transferred to Florida, where his behavior started getting even more and more erratic and paranoid and sometimes even violent, and he began to think that his superiors were plotting something against him.
So by 1868, it was pretty clear that Miner's mind was not well, and Army doctors diagnosed him as having monomania, or an obsession with one subject, which gives rise to delusions. They also said that he was suicidal and homicidal. So Miner went to the Government Hospital for the Insane in Washington, D.C., which later became St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and he actually volunteered for this. He volunteered to go, and then after 18 months in that facility, doctors decided that Miner was, quote, incapacitated by causes arising in the line of duty. So he was basically forced to retire from the Army, but he did win a lifetime Army commission.
So he was going to be taken care of financially?
Yes.
So after being released from the Army, Miner returned to Connecticut and spent a little bit of time with his family. But his family soon decided that England was the place for him to be, because they were really hoping that maybe if he went there, Miner could settle down a little bit, maybe start painting again, meet up with some talented people, start to earn his reputation back. So they packed him off with his paint and a letter of introduction to the art critic and drawing master John Ruskin, hoping that Ruskin would be some sort of entree to English society for Miner, somebody to introduce him to people who could help him start recovering.
But for reasons that are still unclear, Miner didn't seem to even try to blend into respectable society when he got to England at the end of 1871. He settled in the Lambeth section of London, one of the lowest, seediest, most crime-ridden parts of the city. Some people think he might have moved there because he had easier access to prostitutes from this area, but we're not sure. So we don't know much about his time there, but it seems that his delusions just continued to get worse. He thought people, Irishmen in particular, were trying to break into his room at night. It seems like that vision of the branded Irishman, his experience with that, was kind of coming back to haunt him at this point.
Yeah, in fact, according to an account kept by the Berkshire Record Office, Miner made a report to Scotland Yard shortly before Christmas saying that he thought men were trying to force their way into his room at night to poison him. He believed these men to be Irish, and Scotland Yard just dismissed him as a crazy man, didn't follow up on it, didn't do anything about it. Then, on February 17th, 1872, a constable was patrolling the Lambeth area and heard several shots ring out at about 2 a.m. He rushed off in the direction the shots came from, blowing his whistle on the way to alert other constables in the area to come in and support him. And who should he find holding the gun but William Chester Miner?
Yes, Miner had shot and killed a man named George Merritt, a working man who was innocently on his way to work at a brewery, a man who Miner had never met. So we're going to leave you with that cliffhanger for this part 1 of the William Chester Miner podcast. But next time, we're going to talk a little bit about the motive behind Miner's crime, his trial, and where he ends up after that as his illness continues to progress, and of course, how he gets involved in the creation of the first Oxford English Dictionary. Because, of course, in case you've forgotten, this is a story about that, too.
It's a dictionary podcast. I'm sure most people have kind of forgotten by now with all of this insanity and murder and Civil War action going on.
And you thought dictionaries had to be boring.
Not at all. So I guess that is a good time to transition to a little listener mail.
It is. We have a letter here from Lindsay in Tennessee, and I wanted to read this because it relates to the theme of Civil War doctors.
Very much so.
Yes. She says, "Hi, Sarah and Deblina. I know you enjoy hearing what listeners are doing while they listen to the podcast, so I thought I'd share what I was doing while I listened to your podcast on Dr. McGuire and Stonewall Jackson. Strangely enough, I was listening to the podcast while cataloging a book of Civil War songs called Singing Soldiers, Spirit of the 60s, A History of the Civil War in Song. One of the songs in the book is entitled Stonewall's Requiem, which, as you can imagine, was written in 1863 about Stonewall Jackson's death. I'll share the lyrics with you, and there are a lot of lyrics here, so I'm not going to read them all, but I'll just read the first one out. It says, "The muffled drum is beating, there's a sad and solemn tread, our banners draped in mourning as it shrouds the illustrious dead. Proud forms are bent with sorrow, and all Southern hearts are sore. The hero now is sleeping, noble Stonewall is no more." So that was actually the first 2 verses, but thank you, Lindsay, for sending that in. That is quite the coincidence that you were cataloging that as you were listening to the podcast. Yeah, those are always fun. So if you have any of those you want to share with us, please write us. We're at historypodcast@howstuffworks.com, or you can look us up on Facebook, or we're on Twitter at Missed in History.
And if you want to try to figure out where this podcast part 1 is going before you even hear part 2, you can check out an article we have on our website called What Makes a Killer. Find it by searching for What Makes a Killer at www.howstuffworks.com.
Be sure to check out our new video podcast, Stuff from the Future. Join How Stuff Works staff as we explore the most promising and perplexing possibilities of tomorrow. The How Stuff Works iPhone app has arrived. Download it today on iTunes.